Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about gender issues. Why do we consistently keep talking about gender issues in a psychology of sexuality class, you might ask? Well, I've asked myself the same exact question. Because what does gender have to do with sexuality? Well, honestly, it's unknown. That might sound a little bit silly right now. It's not unknown in the fact that we don't have a bunch of information suggesting things. However, it's unknown because you can't really prove it, you can't really disprove it. We kind of find ourselves in this lockjam whenever we're talking about gender. Because you got to ask this ultimate question. How does gender influence sexuality? Does gender infer sexuality? How does biology influence gender? How does biology influence sexuality? Is identifying with a gender associated with whether you want to have sex with the opposite gender or even the same gender? Is it super complex? Yes. This is where I always get jammed up a little bit because my knowledge on gender and sexuality is extensive. But again, in order to get all the information out of my head and get it into your head, I struggle a little bit because it's like I'm constantly bouncing around with the very first thing we're going to talk about, which is this biopsychosocial approach, which I wrote right there. There it is, on gender identity formation. Because again, in order to give the biopsychosocial approach to gender and sexuality, we have to be covering all things of the body, all things of the mind, and all things of the social context that could be associated with these phenomena. And so again, it's very complex. Your book opens up talking about some general vocabulary just so we can introduce some words to begin talking about these things. And then where I'm going is, how are all these concepts associated? So initially we have biological sex, which is this range between male and female. And again, you have to go back millions of years to when we split from being hermaphroditic to dividing our DNA and then mixing them to create diversity. This goes back to when, we were still in the oceans as sharks or whatever and fish. So it's really complex. But at some point in human evolution, we split into males and females. However, while that evolution was happening in our DNA, other possibilities continue to exist, or evolutionarily speaking, and again, this is where it really gets complex. It's asking these questions like, where does intersex fit in? So the book and other areas like to label things like intersex as a disorder, but why do we have these chromosomal variations that range between male and female? And so again, does this evolve from millions of years of human history? Why is it still in our DNA to have these disorders, or what they might call disorders, which I have a whole list there on intersex. You can pause it and read that. I'm about to go into it. But again, it's really complex because, again, this idea of biological sex, the idea that we're supposed to range between male and female, again, this goes back to millions of years in evolution. And so our DNA is set up this way, but our DNA also has these quirks in which we don't just create males and females. There are over 100 variations of what makes up biological sex, and what makes up biological sex are chromosomes, gonads, hormones. I have a whole list over here. Chromosomes, gonads, hormones, reproductive structures, all of these things, sex differentials in the brain. These are all the factors that we look at to determine whether, someone is male or female or intersex. But again, there are over 100 combinations of chromosomes, gonads, hormones, reproductive structures, and sex differentiations in the brain goes on extensively. It's a whole other subject which we're going to talk about. But again, the idea of biological sex is ridiculously complex. And so again, hence that even though we're in a psychology class, we have to understand biology, because how does your biological sex structure the brain? And then how does that influence your behavior, your hormone levels? All of these things have to be considered. So it's insanely complex. And again, I don't know what else to say on that. But when we're talking about biological sex, that's what we're talking about. We're looking at someone's chromosomes, gonads, hormones, reproductive structures, you know, and genitals, and we're asking, can we classify them as male, female, or intersex? When it comes to gender, it's a lot more complex. Some definitions of gender are going to look at gender as this social construct, in that gender categories are created through symbolic interaction, using language to interact with each other. Gender categories can be culturally constructed, culturally reproduced from generation to generation. Then you can look at things like the division of labor. Did we divide into males and females to divide the labor so that we could increase our likelihood to survive? Okay, and so when it comes to gender, it's very complex again, because it would be so great if it was so simple that we could say something like gender is a social construct. We're the ones who come up with the categories, and then we structure your behavior by socializing you to act in a specific way based upon your biological sex or whatever it might be. But again, where I'm coming from, I'm saying, look, how do these variations of your biological sex, how do the levels of hormones, your chromosomes, the diverse reproductive structures we have, how do these influence, one, the social construction of gender identity categories, but two, then our identification with these categories? Because I like to ask the question, which is really complex: where did gender categories come from in the first place? Okay, humans made them, but why did we make them? Do we make the categories because we're trying to label the way we feel inside and the way we want to behave, and, like, just like we identify with our country or whatever it might be, a music that we like? We come up with categories like rock and roll because that's the kind of style we like. Then there's categories like rap. Maybe that's the style you like. Maybe you like both categories and you're into all the categories. But again, that's the same idea with gender. It's supposed to be this social construct. But again, I have to question, how much does your biology and then your brain structure itself influence why humans created these categories in the first place? And then how does that influence your identity with these categories? So gender identity is then the self-recognition or even social labeling that you adopt or internalize, and then that's the decision of what category you buy into. Okay, and so again, we all of our identities are based upon these structures. Like, who are you as a person? I'm a professor. That's, a category. I'm a dad. That's a category. I'm a Cubs fan. That's a category. I love Chicago. That's a category. I'm a musician. That's a category. Gender is the same thing. In order to structure our identity, answer the question of who we are as people, we often look to these cultural constructs or these structures in society from which we can use as pillars of our identity to decide who we are as people and to give some boundaries to our sense of ourself. And so gender identity is the same thing. By you selecting or choosing a gender, you are then creating these boundaries of the category or the set of behaviors, expectations, whatever it might be, that you buy into. And so gender identity, though, often isn't a conscious decision because, again, we're socialized from such a young age to buy into these gender categories and then fulfill the social roles and expectations attached to these categories. And then we can form our behaviors, we can form our personality, we can form ourselves to the categories. But again, the categories are socially constructed. So not everyone's going to totally buy into being feminine. Otherwise, you'd have a bunch of, like, girls running around constantly being all ha ha ha, woo girls and whatever it might be. But again, you're going to see incredible variation when it comes to things like, what does it mean to be a girl? What does it mean to be feminine? There are jocks that are like, boys that are super jocks that are all like muscular workout. Then there's other guys who were like, I don't want any of that. I just want to hang out and laugh and drink a beer and play some video games. And like, I don't want to be this uber testosterone, angry, violent, typical male that I'm supposed to be. Okay? And so, again, within males, within females, within all the potential genders, there are ranges of behavior. There's not just one type of lesbian. There's not one type of straight male. Okay, it's very, very complex. Within each category, there's incredible variation. Same thing goes with like race based cultures. There's not like one typical black guy. Within black male culture, there is an incredible variation of the tough black male, the nerdy black male, the punk rock black male, the jock black male. And there's the same thing with white males. And then again, the better questions are they actually black or white? Well, genetically, no, you're not black and white, but because we socially constructed ethnic categories that we then called racial categories, we buy into these groups, and then once you belong to that group, you conform to the norms and expectations of that group. And so when it comes to words like gender expression, how we express our identity, you express your gender identity within the culturally accepted social norms that we all conform to. You conform your behavior, your personality, your sense of self to meet the social roles, and then you play the part. Like dramaturgical theory, we're all actors on a stage. Once you find out you're a girl, what do? You act like a girl, and that's called doing gender. Once you find out you're a boy, what do? However, maybe it's more complex than that. Maybe gender is not just this socially molded, socially constructed cultural way of life. Maybe gender is influenced by our biology. Think about the way you feel. Do you feel what we would call masculine inside, or feminine inside, or some range of there between? And so, again, it's super complex. And again, how does all of this influence our actual sexuality? Because, think about things like what is your body actually into? If your body is set up in such a way that you're attracted to certain scents, smells, genitalia, whatever it might be, again, your body is primed toward that. And so, how does that influence the way that you act and behave sexually? And then to make it even more complex, along with your gender categories, there are sexual expectations that are linked with the gender expectations. Again, we have a social script for relationships, right? If you're a male, you pay the check and you're supposed to be the person who asks them out, and you're supposed to be the one to initiate the first kiss after you ask consent and all of that, right? And is the girl supposed to be like submissive and blah, 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 blah? So again, how much of it's a script, but how much of it's influenced by your biology? Girls acting in typical girl fashion, is that actually what their biology wants? That social script that we write and we all perform, how much of that's influenced by our own biological chemistry driving us to act in certain ways? Kind of like a mating ritual. Look at all the other animal species on the planet. They all have these mating rituals. It's built into us. And so the social script is influenced by these biological processes. Hence, it's ridiculously complex. So the linkage between this biopsychosocial approach to gender and sexuality and race and all the other things that might come up in this class is very complex, and we have to deconstruct it and examine it from multiple levels. And again, like when I first started teaching, I'd be like, how many sexes are there? I'd be like, male, female. How many genders are there? Male, female, transgender. Now it's more complex. How many sexes are there? Now my classes have to say at least three: male, female, intersex. How many genders are there? An infinite number, because we can constantly be socially constructing new gender categories. And if you look at all the gender categories on Facebook or any of those things where they have the drop down bar, the list goes on forever. You know, like yeah, so that's just it. I mean, culture is constantly creating new vocabulary for genders. And I'm going to put up a good assignment on a lot of this for you guys to look at this week. But so you're going to be thinking about how does biology influence gender, gender identity, gender expression, the script for sexuality. How does gender or your sense of your gender influence what you're sexually attracted to? How much is biology playing a part there? It's very complex. Again, how is your brain structure associated with what you're attracted to? How are hormone levels like estrogen and testosterone influencing what you're sexually attracted to? And then your cognitions, you know, once you identify with these categories, how does it influence the way you think? And then your overall behavior in the social context. How does your biology influence your behavior? How do your thoughts influence your behavior? What kind of unconscious processes are going on that are influencing your sense of self as masculine or feminine or whatever it might be, or your sense of, hotness or arousal, which we'll talk about next chapter. But again, regarding these hundreds of variations, I put up a bunch of lists from your book. Again, for intersex, you have the book labels these as disorders. And again, I'm always wondering, is it a disorder or is it just part of human DNA? It's just, again, it's these cultural labels that I struggle with, but yada, 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 I'll move on. Turner syndrome is having one less chromosome, generally labeled as XO, and you just have this results in external genitalia evolves. Internal genitalia is underdeveloped, not genitalia. Internal reproductive organs are underdeveloped. You have no breasts and you end up sterile. Klinefelter syndrome has an extra X, 47 chromosomes, so one more than you're supposed to have, 46. XXY, it's how it's generally labeled. Small testes, undersized penis, sterile, but fertility treatment works for this one. Androgen insensitivity, these are just different labels of intersex based upon variations. 46 XY chromosomes, undersized testes, lacks male or female internal structures, has female genitals but a shallow vagina and tends to be sterile. Fetally androgenized females, 46XX, but they have ovaries but ambiguous external genitalia and sterile. And then DHT deficient, 46XY undersized testes, have ducts, but no prostate, for partially formed vagina, ambiguous external genitals, and sterile. The percentage of population of the world that can be identified as intersex is generally about 1 to 2%. So again, if you add up all of the different types of intersex, you're finding that 1 to 2 out of every 100 people are born this way. Your book goes super deep into the ethics of medical treatment and things along those lines. Please take a look at that. I'm not going to go deep into that because, again, it's just there's so much going on in this. All right, so gender identity formation. Again, this is a biopsychosocial process, as I've introduced you to. And again, you have to ask how much of your gender identity is associated with your biological sex, including your chromosomes, XX or XY for males, XY for males, XX for females, gonads, either ovaries or testes, hormones, androgens, reproductive structures like fallopian tubes, uterus, inner portions of vagina, vas deferens, seminal vesicles, ejaculatory ducts, genitals, including the clitoris, the inner and outer vaginal lips, the penis, the scrotum, and then sex differentiation in the brain. So again, when we look at differences between people based upon biological sex, these are some of the differences that you can have. And based upon these differences, how does that influence your gender identity, your sense of self, basically? And then how does that influence what you're sexually attracted to? Because again, if you have like a male and you have lots of testosterone, are you sexually attracted to hormones containing estrogen? And these are questions that we need to be asking, because there's a lot of males that are born with low levels of testosterone and lots of females that are born with high levels of testosterone. It gets confusing. And so again, how much are levels of testosterone associated to what you're sexually attracted to? So if you have females that have high levels of testosterone but are attracted to females, is it because of their body or is it really a choice? And so again, what you're physically attracted to is often not a choice. Like, you can't help what your body is primed to want. It wants certain foods, it wants certain stimuli, and it knows what it wants. And how much of that can you control? I mean, so that's the stuff we need to be looking at. When I first started my PhD, I asked the question, are males and females different? And if we are different, how much does that influence our actual behavior? And what I've come to find is, despite some of the differences that we might have, the influence of that on behavior is slim to none. I mean, I'm not going to say slim to none. I'm going to say slim because there is some influences. However, psychologists are generally pretty quick to point out that it's that social context, that dividing us at birth into these categories and then treating us differently, socializing us differently, that really results in the major differences between males and females. But again, we have to take that biopsychosocial approach, the nature versus nurture, to consider why are males and females maybe a little bit different. So when it comes to the biology, such as the neuroscience brain structure, the hypothalamus either regulates your production of estrogen or your production of androgens such as testosterone. And so again, based upon how your hypothalamus is, processing information, and then how your body directs things like your gonads to form your ovaries and your testes, and then the triggering of puberty and things along those lines, your chemistry has a lot to do with it. Again, so much of it's out of your control. We find that two areas of the hypothalamus are smaller in females. The cerebral right cortex is thinner in females. The corpus callosum is thicker in females. There's less lateralization in females. So in the book, it gets into some interesting stuff. Like, women, for example, the left side of their brain and the right side of their brain tend to talk more and tend to communicate more, which is why you have that thicker corpus callosum. The discussion between the left and the right brain, it processes, a little bit better than on males. Males are a little bit more selective towards certain parts of the brain, but that can also account for why males might have better visual spatial skills, or girls using both sides of their brain to have better language skills, or whatever it might be. So yes, there are some small differences in gray matter. The book talks about how the male brain is 15% bigger, but again, I put in there that males' bodies are also 15% bigger. So of course they are. It's an exact match. I mean, are they actually bigger? I mean, they're not like processing more information. They're just a little bigger in size because bigger body. I mean, simply. But that doesn't mean they're smarter. Again, women tend to are scoring a little bit higher than men these days in all those categories. So if we were to apply things like learning theories, like stimulus response conditioning, we direct your behavior through, no, you're a girl, you do this. No, you're a boy, you do this. Boys, you go down the blue aisle. Girls, you go down the pink aisle at Walmart. That kind of stuff. So that's the idea of social learning through stimulus and response in the environment. We tend to learn what gender we are, and then we build associations together. Then you have things like operant conditioning, rewards and punishments. If you act in a certain way and dress the way you're supposed to that meets cultural norms, we call you pretty, or we call you handsome. If you're a girl and you wear a tux to prom, they make fun of you. Again, in this way, we structure your gender identity, your gender expression, things along those lines. Then you have things like cognitive theory, where we can sit back and think and reflect and observe and take in information and organize that into schematic understandings. And then our schemas, our knowledge bank then directs how we behave. Bandura's social learning theory, by interacting in the social context and observing, that then cues in what we store in the long-term memories and then structures our identity. So when it comes to gender identity, our sexual behavior, again, we look a lot to culture, to out here, to ask how are we supposed to behave. But again, it's what's in here that influences a lot of our decisions about which way we want to behave out here in the social context. So again, I wrote down here cultural structuring, and that our gender identity, gender roles, a lot of our behaviors, the way we talk, walk, dress, is all highly structured by the social environment in which we live. So even if on the inside we might want to act out in a certain way, a lot of times we have to conform our behavior to make sure that our behavior meets the cultural norms or will be socially sanctioned. Again, if you were like a girl trying to be with another girl back in the day, they would socially sanction you. If you're someone who's trying to identify with a different gender like 50 years ago, they might try to socially sanction you. Although we've had some changes in our social attitudes in modern times, stigma still exists to for those that either are labeled as deviating from social norms, essentially. I like to ask the question though again, when it comes to gender, it's an assumption that gender is like this continuum, somehow that it ranges between male and female. But again, I'm a big fan of things like the sexual configurations theory, which is more like imagine a universe, and each galaxy is like, potential structures of our identity, groups that we can identify with, concepts or ideas, ideologies, things that can center our sense of self. And so it's not like all these galaxies exist on one line. It's more like a balloon, and then we're all kind of held together by gravity. And then, I like to look at it more like that. Your gender, on like an intersectional kind of way, where like your gender, and your book talks about this intersectional gender identity, but thinking about how your gender is associated with like region and your time frame and what epoch we're living in and what's acceptable and not in the social context and your access, and it's just far more complex. Okay, so I put that in here. I do like to ask whether intersex is a disorder of sexual development or whether that's just a natural progression of our DNA. It's a good question. um, Again, your book gets into the ethics of intersectional treatment. Check out that. And just as an epigenetic thing to kind of conclude this, also the social environment influences how our hormones are regulated and the levels of those and things like that. So again, that epigenetics going all the way down to our gene activation is absolutely fascinating to study. When it comes to gender identity, though, your book says it's a spectrum, but again, I like to refer more to my sexual configurations theory that it's not like, all the planets are connected in a straight line. It's more like, you have planets existing within, solar systems, existing within galaxies, existing within this larger universe. And so you have to consider all of your pillars of identity, put all those together to really make sense of who you are and things along those lines. But again, in modern times, we have extended the idea that, it goes beyond this binary system. We've added at least a trinary system. Is that even a word? Trinary? Three? I don't even know if that's a word. But at least three categories of identity. But again, if you look at things like transgender, guys, you got to go all the way back in human history. Like, we've always been mixing it up. Boys have been having sex with boys. Girls have been having sex with like girls. Boys have been dressing up like girls. Just look at Shakespearean actors. I mean, like, so you got to understand that cross-dressing versus transgender, these are two very separate concepts. Again, one is all about identity and sense of self, and the other one is all about expression in the social context. And so we need to separate out all these vocabulary words. But again, gender and the way I look at it is infinite, and that we can constantly create new categories that represent or categorize who we are as people. But in the end, it's just us coming up with categories so that we can attach meanings to words so that we can try to impress upon somebody else who we are as people. And so, I mean, and I like to ask even cooler questions like, what happens if you just let go of gender altogether? You can just be a person. And so that's like queer theory, for example, suggests like maybe we should ditch the categories and just be a person. Why do we need these categories in the first place? Why is it so important to be constantly labeling each other? And so there's a lot of interesting approaches to gender. Whether it's just get rid of the categories and deconstruct them, or embrace a biopsychosocial approach, or maybe gender is exclusively a social construct and it has nothing to do with gender. Again, right now, nobody has a real answer. And that's the beauty of it. It's a relatively new science. We don't understand completely how the body, the brain, the unconscious mind, the conscious mind, and the social context all interact to form gender identities. So again, politicians make their decisions, but how informed are they if even the scientists don't really have the answers to this kind of stuff? All right, so hence the scientific and social understanding of gender, it's contrary. Science is all like, whoa, you just assume it's like that, but do you have any evidence it's like that? And so that's kind of where we're at. Social attitudes over time have changed. You've seen a drastic reduction in stigma. However, we still have structurally stigmatic policies, laws, and social attitudes. We still have interpersonal stigma in which you see like slurs toward people or microaggressions or violence or abuse toward minorities or whatever it might be. And then you also have that individual stigma where people that maybe are labeled as deviating from social norms internalize these negative stereotypes, and that internalized negativity or negative attitudes then causes stress, which affects that person psychologically. Again, it's complex. Just to kind of wrap this up, the gender role idea is what I've been talking about this whole time. When we socially construct gender categories, and then we label you as belonging to these categories, and then we socialize you to act in a way that matches the social expectations and attributes of that category. And then you conform your personality and your identity to the cultural expectations of that category. You are then conforming to the roles that you're supposed to play out in the social context. Again, going back to dramaturgy, actors on a stage. Once you find out you belong to that group, what do? You conform to the cultural way of life of that group, and then you perform that social role. But again, by buying into that social role and performing it, that is then structuring your life. And so, again, how do we learn about gender? How do we learn about how we're supposed to act to meet the expectations of culture regarding the gender group we belong to? Your parents are your primary age of socialization, followed by your peers in the education system, also your siblings, of course, books you read, movies, all those forms of media, religion, right? From out here in the social context, we learn, okay, I belong to this group. How do I act? Right? We perform the rituals, we act out the ceremonies, we play out the social script, we try, we conform. Let's just acknowledge where we're at. So again, if you look at traditional though versus egalitarian gender roles, traditional gender roles are the idea of like women as housemaker and men are providers. Egalitarian gender roles are like, dude, whoever does whatever, it doesn't matter as long as the work gets done. But once you guys buy into those gender roles, how does that structure the way you behave, not only in your like general life at your workplace, but also what's your script when it comes to things like sexuality and sexual expression? Because we have different roles for women, different expectations sexually of women than historically for men, right? If you ask anybody a survey question, how many sexual partners are men supposed to be with? The answer is going to be like as many as possible. For women, it's like zero point 0.4, one is too many. Why do we have double standards? Again, and so these are all socially constructed. But again, once we socially construct these standards, these expectations for each gender, what do? You know what I mean? To avoid shame, to avoid stigma, we'll all engage in certain ways. So again, in order to really delve into sexuality, we have to understand how things like gender might infer or influence our sexuality, the way we express ourselves, what's culturally acceptable. Because again, if you look at males versus females, is what's acceptable for men and women different? Or is it the same? You know what I mean? Are there double standards, triple standards? Is it super complex? And then we can delve into all the individual cultures like gay culture, lesbian culture, polyculture, bisexual culture. Does each level of diversity create different expectations culturally? Are there different roles within each one? And so, again, it's just so freaking complex. So, again, I keep saying again a lot. I'm so sorry for that. But again, it's just so complex. So that's why I keep pushing this biopsychosocial. You have to be thinking about all the variables that influence the way you think and the way you behave. In order to do that, it's ridiculously complex. So I'm hoping you guys are catching on to that. And also, what's cool is nobody really knows for sure what's up. We're still learning. And so, fascinating stuff. I appreciate y'all's time. Thank you for thinking about gender, how gender is socially constructed, how gender structures our way of life, how gender might structure our sexuality. Again, how does biology influence gender? How does your cognitions and the structure of your brain influence gender identity? How does the social context mold our gender identity? Some important concepts to set us up for what's coming. Just like we had to talk about anatomy. Why are we talking about anatomy? Because again, depending upon the anatomy, dictates what stimulates you, and then yada yada yada. It goes on for days. I'm not going to rehash anatomy today, but something to be thinking about. Make sure you check that one out again. All right, peace out, y'all.